when your grand plans collapse. A Zen sleep story. Right now there is a distinct, heavy, hollow ache resting right at the center of the abdomen. A stark sensation of sudden, visceral dropping that catches your breath every time your mind wanders back to the wreckage of your grand design. It is the specific physical weight of a sudden collapse, the devastating internal echo that remains when a long-term personal ambition, a cherished creative venture, or a monumental life project slumps entirely into the mud. You feel an empty, cavernous vulnerability right where your core used to hold its structural pride. A deep somatic exhaustion born from watching years of meticulous architecture wash away in a single season of unforeseen storms. Your stomach carries the cold shock of this sudden void, holding a raw, defensive emptiness that comes from realizing you can no longer hold back the heavy currents that swept your creation away. The immediate atmosphere of your dark room is adapting to the quiet, solitary hours of the late evening, creating a workspace of soft shadow where your exhaustion can safely unburden itself. Outside, the night air holds the cool, sharp scent of damp river moss and the low, heavy smell of wet earth after an autumn downpour. Inside, the dim indigo shadows cast by a large canvas dropcloth draped over a storage chest in the corner merge with the slow, rhythmic dripping of a loose rain gutter outside the window pane, providing an unhurried, mechanical rhythm for the ears. The heavy, cool texture of the cotton sheet beneath your midsection begins to match the temperature of your skin, gently inviting the protective, knotted muscles surrounding your stomach to release their frantic, internal bracing. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting your abdomen drop completely into the firm support beneath you, allowing the splintered fragments of your vanished plans to rest uncounted in the dark. You are not broken, dear friend. What you are feeling in this hollow, dropped space at the center of your posture is not failure, nor is it proof that your vital life force has been permanently ruined, because your creation could not withstand the physics of the flood. The vast emptiness you hold tonight is a natural clearing, a profound indication that your true nature is vast enough to survive the absolute dismantling of the structures you built to contain it. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and we will not demand that you immediately find a clever lesson or a silver lining within the wreckage of your hard labor. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not need to rebuild the entire foundation before you are permitted to let your body stop holding back the water. Right now, nothing is required of you, and you are safe enough to soften. There is a deep, illuminating paradox hidden within the core of Buddhist wisdom that meets this specific creative grief with an unexpected tenderness. We live under the persistent illusion that our identity and our inner worth are intimately tied to the intact survival of our external creations. We practice a quiet form of ownership over our projects, believing that if we can build a large enough container, a beautiful business, a flawless relationship, a monumental creative legacy, we can permanently secure our spirit against the fluid, unpredictable nature of the world. But the profound insight of the Zen tradition reveals that suffering does not arise from the natural disintegration of the timber gate. The agony takes root when the mind insists that its own capacity for light was shattered when the wood gave way. This is the truth of the broken timber lock. When a massive oak sluice gate splits under the pressure of a seasonal torrent, the carefully collected reservoir water drains completely away into the marsh, leaving an empty, muddy channel behind. Yet, the vast open space that allowed the reservoir to exist in the first place has not been scratched by a single splinter. The open sky that hung over the water remains completely intact, silent, and undisturbed by the collapse of the wood. Maybe you have felt this too, the sudden, suffocating realization at midnight that the project you poured your entire vitality into has left you with nothing but a hollow, silted void. The mind turns inward, transforming the structural failure into an intense personal indictment, whispering that because your structure broke, you are fundamentally empty, incompetent, and hollowed out. This is the mechanism that adds a second wound to the original sorrow of your loss. The first pain is simply the raw, mathematical reality of a changing world where materials break, plans fail, and floods arrive without warning. The second pain is the cruel judgment you strike against your own center, declaring that you are ruined simply because the container emptied. But the muddy floor of the empty channel does not apologize to the river for its lack of water, and the broken timber does not dictate the depth of the wide horizon. The collapse you replay in your thoughts is merely a temporary rearrangement of form, completely unable to diminish the deep, untroubled awareness that is cradling your body tonight. In a few moments, our attention will journey toward a misty valley marshland during a gray autumn downpour, where a designer sat staring at the splintered fragments of wet oak grain encrusted with riverweed, feeling the exact same visceral dropping that is weighing down your stomach right now. But before we enter that damp, low-lying landscape, allow your awareness to notice the physical weight of your midsection. Let the deep muscles of your core expand outward. Let the diaphragm drop down without any restriction. And let the small of your back release its tight coordination. You do not need to force anything tonight, and you do not have to guarantee that your path will feel clear before the morning arrives. The world will manage its own currents without your frantic engineering for the next few hours, and every vanished plan, every broken venture, and every empty reservoir can remain completely suspended in the dark. We spend so much of our creative energy treating our presence as a structure that must always be full, believing that if our reserves empty out, we have lost our right to occupy space on the earth. We evaluate our worth by the volume of water we can hold back, and then we wonder why our inner center feels so hollow and thinned when the project shatters. But the dark mud of the empty riverbed does not feel a shred of guilt for sitting quiet beneath the midnight mist, and the uncarved banks do not apologize to the sky for remaining unwatered. The suffering you hold does not come from the simple fact that your timber lock split. It grows from the current resistance that refuses to let the channel be empty, without demanding that your core be immediately filled. Let another breath arrive naturally, without you needing to measure its volume or direct its path. Let it fill the spaces behind your ribs, down through the small of your back, and deep into the very center of your abdomen. You are nothing more than a living form resting in a quiet room, completely free from the metrics, timelines, and structures of the waking world. In the deep silence that is growing between us, the cool evening air is moving through the wet earth outside, requiring no intact monuments and demanding no full reservoirs before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, cool texture of the cloth against your skin, as we prepare to step onto the damp grass of the valley marsh, where the warden is waiting to show us how to let the current pass through the broken gate. Deep within a misty, low-lying valley marshland where the gray autumn sky seemed to rest directly upon the tops of the bending reeds, a vast expanse of open water channels ran silently through the peat. The damp, low environment always smelled heavily of decomposing river reeds, waterlogged soil, and the sharp, tannic odor of wet oak timbers submerged in the current. In this isolated landscape lived Taku, a master canal designer who had spent 7 long winters engineering a colossal timber lock network designed to capture, hold, and perfectly distribute the mountain runoff to the low provinces. Taku moved along the earthen dikes with a heavy, hollow stride, his chest slightly hollowed, carrying a distinct, sinking emptiness right at the center of his abdomen. Only 3 nights before, an unprecedented seasonal downpour had turned the mountain streams into a terrifying wall of dark, unyielding water, bursting the reservoirs and completely shattering the immense wood infrastructure he had built. During his early years as an apprentice, Taku had dreamed of creating a masterwork that would outlast the generations, a definitive monument of water engineering that would prove his absolute control over the elements. He had poured every ounce of his creative vitality, his sleepless nights, and his reputation into the placement of the great oak sluice gates, believing that the structural perfection of the wood was the true measure of his worth as a builder. When the main lock system split under the immense mathematical pressure of the flood, it did not merely drain the reservoir, it felt as though it ripped away Taku's entire internal core, leaving him to look out over the mud with a bitter, heavy sense of personal devastation. He spent his days wandering the edges of the washouts, holding his hands over his stomach, completely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that the grand architecture which defined his entire life had been completely erased in a single watch of the night. The keeper of this wide, sodden marshland was Master Genrin, an old warden who lived in a small wicker hut built on stilts above the high-water line, whose skin was weather-worn and dark like ancient peat, and whose movements carried the slow, unhurried ease of the changing tides. Genrin spent his days building simple, temporary dirt dams to protect the nesting waterfowl, completely unconcerned with grand engineering metrics or the permanent containment of the river. He was intimately familiar with the specific weight of Taku's creative grief, recognizing the dropped, defensive posture of the young builder whenever he dragged his feet through the marsh grasses, staring blankly at the ruined channels. On a morning when the gray rain had slowed to a fine, persistent mist that hung motionless over the wetlands, Genrin asked Taku to accompany him to the primary breach where the largest gate had once stood. The landscape was quiet, save for the low, sodden thud of drifting logs shifting in the deep silt down below. In the center of the watched-out bank, half buried in the cold gray mud, lay a splintered fragment of wet oak grain encrusted with riverweed, the solitary remaining timber from a gate that had taken 3 winters to carve by hand. Taku stood on the crumbling edge of the dike, his arms locked tightly across his midsection, the hollow ache in his abdomen intensifying as he watched the old marsh warden wade down into the silt. The designer assumed he was about to receive a strict lesson on choosing stronger timbers or reinforcing the iron braces, his internal muscles tightening as he prepared to defend the accuracy of his original designs against the unpredictable violence of the flood. Master Genrin did not evaluate the thickness of the wood, and he did not comment on the layout of the broken channels. Instead, he reached down into the cold water, lifted the heavy, splintered fragment of oak, and handed it directly to Taku, asking him to hold its waterlogged weight and observe exactly what the river had truly taken away from the valley. Taku held the wet wood, the rough, torn fibers scraping against the skin of his palms, his voice thick and strained with a sudden, visceral grief as he looked out at the empty marsh. He replied that the river had taken everything years of his life, the pride of the province, the perfect structure that kept the water beautiful, and the entire purpose of his existence as a designer. He confessed that the empty, muddy channel before them felt exactly like the void inside his own stomach, a ruined, useless ditch where all the stored energy had completely drained away, leaving nothing but an ugly mound of silt and splintered garbage where a grand monument used to stand. The old marsh warden reached out and gently laid his hand over the splintered oak fragment in Taku's grip. He told the engineer that the river had certainly broken the timber gate and emptied the basin, but it had completely failed to touch the actual landscape that allowed the water to flow. Genrin pointed out that the vast, open space which held the reservoir was not built by the oak planks. The valley itself was what gathered the rain, and the wide sky hanging over the marsh had not lost a single inch of its depth when the timber gave way. The agonizing emptiness Taku held did not come from the mathematical failure of the lock system. It grew entirely from his own exhausting habit of standing over the empty riverbed, staring down at the splintered wood, and believing that his own internal capacity to create had been washed away with the water. Taku stood motionless in the gray mist, the smell of the damp river moss settling deep into his senses as his hands slowly relaxed their tight pressure against the wet oak fragment. For the first time since the storm arrived, the rigid, knotted constriction surrounding his midsection began to soften, allowing a deep, unhurried breath to reach the very bottom of his abdomen. He looked past the ruined bank toward the endless expanse of the open wetlands, realizing that the monumental structure he had lost was merely a temporary shape built inside a vast, permanent valley, an architecture that could be dismantled by the currents without ever diminishing the wide, uncarved space that was still waiting to receive the rain. Slowly, the heavy, grounded stillness of that rainy marsh moves into the quiet space of your own dark room tonight, letting the image of the splintered oak timber mirror the exact condition of your own shattered heart. You have been lying awake replaying the collapse of your grand design, measuring the depth of the empty void inside your core, and letting the sudden failure of your external project convince you that your spirit is permanently hollowed out. You have believed that because the container you built with your vitality has broken apart, your actual capacity to hold value has been spent. But the vast, unmeasured valley of your true nature remains completely open, entirely indifferent to the number of structures that have fallen into the mud. Let the broken timbers rest in the silt, allowing your awareness to settle into the wide, peaceful depth of this single hour. This reflection on the splintered oak timber and the drained marshland channel is not telling us to stop feeling the profound sorrow of a collapsed ambition, nor is it asking us to become cold, unyielding walls that remain completely unbothered when the projects we love dissolve into nothing. It is not an invitation to build a state of forced detachment where we pretend that losing years of dedicated creative work does not leave a genuine deep ache inside our physical core. Instead, it is revealing an internal movement that is much quieter, a gentle shift in perspective that allows us to witness the dismantling of our structures without allowing that empty space to define our absolute capacity to live. The persistent, heavy, hollow sensation that rests directly within the center of your abdomen tonight does not persist simply because the external project broke down. The deepest suffering takes root when the mind insists on holding that ruined container as the permanent, final measure of your internal value. When we look at this lat-night grief through the clear, simple lens of Buddhist insight, we see that what we often describe as attachment is actually that stubborn, defensive knot in the stomach that declares, "Until I can see my project perfectly restored and completely safe, my entire system must remain in a state of active, rigid mourning." It is the exhausting habit of locking our fundamental stability into the survival of external forms, desperately trying to construct a permanent monument out of shifting materials, just to convince ourselves that we are real. We treat our creative achievements as if they were massive timber locks that must never split under the pressure of the river. And when a sudden downpour sweeps the wood away, we believe our actual spirit has been split in two. This is the modern reality of craving. It is the frantic, lat-night looping that keeps us mentally rebuilding the ruined walls or projecting future failures, hoping that one more round of architectural worry will somehow secure our worth and save us from the void. But a broken plank half buried in the silt cannot dictate the depth of the wide sky. No matter how many times you replay the crash of the timber gate against the dark ceiling of your room, the hard labor has already ended. The structures have already shifted. The water has already drained away into the marsh. When we lie awake burning our vital energy to maintain these old definitions, we are participating in a quiet internal process that adds a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the raw, mathematical reality of a changing world where materials break, seasons shift, and floods arrive without checking our calendars. These experiences are genuinely heavy, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable movement of human existence. The second wound, however, is the one we strike against our own center, when our thoughts turn inward and declare, "Because your creation collapsed, you are permanently hollowed out, useless and ruined." Let this quiet realization sit directly next to the hollow dropping sensation in the middle of your posture right now. Consider what happens when we replace that desperate desire for absolute control with simple, spacious awareness. This quality of mind is not a complex discipline that you must perform perfectly before you are allowed to rest your head. It is simply the capacity to look directly at the empty riverbed of your project without allowing that mud to dictate the width of your current breath. It is the ability to observe the rigid sadness in your core, to label it gently as the old habit of defining yourself by the container, and to recognize that the silt belongs entirely to the valley floor, not to the wide, uncarved landscape that is holding you tonight. When you allow the splintered oak to rest in the water, without continuously gripping the rough fibers with your thoughts, you stop feeding the friction that keeps your stomach raw. You let the collapse exist in the past while you remain open in the present room. Impermanence, when translated into the immediate texture of your evening rest, becomes an immense sanctuary for a devastated heart. It acts as a gentle reminder that the monumental project you lost was not a solid, eternal block trapped inside your identity. That grand design was a temporary arrangement of form that belonged to a specific season. It has no physical power to reach into the dark and diminish the deep, untroubled awareness that is watching it tonight. The body lying in this room is entirely separate from those vanished plans, its abdomen capable of dropping into a clean, ancient rhythm that has never been restricted by the walls of a canal. You do not have to force your current muscles to maintain a defensive guard just to protect a structure that has already returned to the landscape. True letting go does not mean you abandon your love for what you built, or that you pretend the loss did not feel heavy. It means you stop using the survival of the timber lock as a metric to determine whether you are permitted to take a full, unhurried breath in the dark. It means you acknowledge the empty, silted channels of your ambition. Look at the wreckage with a soft, non-judgmental eye, and then allow the water to flow where it wills, without demanding that your spirit become full before you are allowed to sleep. When you drop the expectation that your life must always hold an intact reservoir for the world to see, you discover that true compassion is the willingness to stand in your own empty center and hold your vulnerable core with a tenderness that requires no external validation. Right now, notice how effortlessly your body is managing its own survival in the dark, completely unconcerned with the grand designs you tried to complete during the daylight hours. Your pulse does not check the status of your achievements before it agrees to warm your limbs, and your lungs do not demand an intact monument from the valley before they open to receive the cool night breeze. You are already being sustained by a deep, natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of human engineering, resting securely within a night that requires no full containers before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, cool texture of the cloth against your skin as we prepare to step onto the silent delta banks, where the reed weaver is waiting to show us the nature of the space that remains when the tools are laid down. If it feels right, let your attention gather very gently right at the center of your abdomen, arriving at the exact physical boundaries where that distinct, heavy, hollow ache has been anchoring its energy. There is no need to actively push the memory of the collapse away, and there is no requirement to make your mind completely quiet by force. Simply notice the physical texture of the emptiness, observing the stubborn dropping sensation in your core, as if you were merely looking at a splintered fragment of wet oak grain resting in the mud, without any urgency to clean the riverweed or patch the broken wood back together. As you rest here in the deep indigo-shadowed stillness of the late evening hour, perhaps you can invite a slow wave of softening to move through the deep muscles of your stomach and lower back. Let the small, rigid fibers surrounding your midsection loosen their protective grip, allowing the diaphragm to drop naturally, and let your core feel wide, as if it were dissolving into the cool, damp earth beneath your frame. There is no pressure to achieve a sudden state of profound emotional healing in this moment, and even just noticing that your internal muscles still feel tight, guarded, or hollowed out is entirely enough. You are simply taking stock of your own internal landscape, acknowledging where the mind has been buckle-strapping its armor against the vast uncertainty of creative failure. Right now, let the specific memory of that shattered design float up into your awareness. Perhaps the exact moment where you realized the project could not be saved, the exhaustion of watching your hard labor dissolve, or the general, heavy worry that you will be completely cast aside if anyone sees the empty space in your foundation. Do not try to analyze the validity of the failure, and do not try to fix the perception of the people you wish to impress. Instead, just name the emotional pattern that is currently tightening across your core. You might say to yourself very quietly, "This is the habit of standing over the empty basin," or "This is the old defensive heat trying to rebuild the broken timber gate." Just by naming it, you are stepping out of the dark, urgent internal courtroom and standing beside Master Genrin in the fine mist, looking at the waterlogged wood from a place of unhurried safety. Imagine that your vanished ambition is like that splintered fragment of wet oak grain, its natural texture having become heavy and caked in silt from years of continuous engineering. Look at its fractured shape in your mind's eye. See how many times your thoughts have gripped that broken material today. fixing your sight entirely upon the ruined structure, letting that hollow ditch convince you that your true nature has been permanently ruined. In this quiet space, if it feels comfortable, imagine taking that heavy, burning need to appear completely controlled, that persistent wish to hide your natural emptiness, and allowing it to rest quietly inside the split, waterlogged layers of the wood. You do not have to rebuild the lock system with your exhaustion, and you do not have to make the channel clean. You are simply setting the timber down in the silt while you step back into your own breathing body. Watch what happens to the internal space across your core as you let the project sit outside of your identity. Perhaps the image of the ruined gate begins to change its texture under the steady, cool sweep of the night air. The faint, damp scent of decomposing river reeds rises from the marsh, filling the room with a clean, grounded quality that has nothing to do with the forced architecture. The valley does not collapse, and the foundations remain completely solid beneath your weight, holding their space with absolute security. The silt on the valley floor does not diminish the capacity of the earth to receive the mountain runoff. It is simply a layer of mud in the channel, entirely separate from the deep, unmeasured sky that is holding you tonight. If your thoughts begin to drift back toward the low provinces, the expectations of the builders, or the structures you wish you could restore to prove your absolute worth, you can return to the simple, rhythmic expansion of your lower lungs whenever you are ready. There is no failure in a mind that wanders back to its wreckage. The slow rain outside the window pane does not apologize for moving in the dark, and your memories are no different from that natural occurrence. They are simply configurations resting in your vast open hall of awareness, and they cannot permanently break your true self unless you choose to believe that you are the broken timber. Nothing needs to be forced tonight, dear friend. You are not required to empty your heart of its grief through an act of sheer will, and you do not have to guarantee that your path will feel clear before the morning light arrives. You are simply a living form, letting the heavy, unalterable rolls of the builder rest in the mud, while the unmoving dark continues to cradle your center, leaving your inner valley wide, unpolished, and deeply at peace. Farther down the valley, where the narrow channels slowly widened into a vast, silent delta bank, the freshwater streams finally met the endless gray bay. The atmosphere in this open, flat shoreline always carried the cool, salty breath of the coastal fog, the thick scent of marsh reeds, and the quiet sound of small waves lapping against the low banks. In this expansive setting lived Sano, an irrigation builder who had devoted several seasons to constructing an intricate network of terraced water gardens along the low hillsides bordering the delta. Sano moved along the muddy paths with a rigid, protective posture, his chest slightly guarded, carrying that same distinct, heavy, hollow ache deep within the center of his abdomen. Only a fortnight ago, a sudden landslip on the upper ridge had caused an avalanche of wet earth to slide down the slope, completely burying his terraced channels under a thick, suffocating blanket of heavy silt, erasing his entire life's work in a single morning. Instead of accepting the natural shift of the earth, Sano had been consumed by an intense, defensive desperation. Returning to the buried terraces day after day with a small wooden shovel, he worked until his palms were raw and bleeding, trying frantically to dig out the blocked channels, his mind racing with a burning anxiety that he would be cast aside by the valley community if he could not restore the beautiful flow of his gardens. The harder he fought against the massive weight of the silt, the more his physical energy collapsed, until he found himself sitting on a half-buried stone wall, his breathing shallow, his hands trembling with a profound sense of failure and inner exhaustion. He felt that his entire creative identity had been permanently ruined, his stomach holding a cold, tight knot of shame as he stared at the featureless gray mud that covered his grand design. The only other resident of this wide delta bank was Sister Miyoko, an elder nun who had spent many winters living on a simple floating raft woven from thick marsh reeds, whose presence carried the quiet, unhurried stability of the deep water, and whose hands were permanently rough from working with wet fiber. Miyoko never gave formal lectures on the nature of non-self or the impermanence of human structures, spending her hours weaving simple sleeping mats, or tracking the movement of the tides across the mudflats. She had been quietly watching Sano's frantic, daily struggle with the silt, recognizing the mechanical, desperate rhythm of his shovel, and the heavy, defensive dropping in his core whenever he looked out at the ruined terraces. On an afternoon when the low coastal fog had rolled so far inland that it completely obscured the horizon, turning the delta into a silent room of gray mist and water, Mayoko paddled her small skiff over to the bank where Sano sat. She did not offer empty words of comfort to ease his grief, and she did not encourage him to dig faster. Instead, she reached into the bottom of her wooden boat, pulled out a hollowed willow bark, measuring scoop caked in dry silt, an ordinary, unadorned tool that had been used for years to measure out seeds in river silt, and laid it quietly on the flat stone beside his bleeding hands. Sano sat with his arms locked tightly across his midsection, his lower abdomen holding its familiar, painful constriction, his mind immediately preparing a defensive excuse as he looked at the old nun. He assumed she was about to judge his clumsy handling of the irrigation channels, or tell him that his design had been structurally flawed from the beginning, his internal muscles tightening against the expectation of criticism. Sister Miyoko did not pick up a shovel, and she did not inspect the buried walls. Instead, she took the hollowed willow scoop, dipped it directly into the open, moving water of the delta channel, and emptied it back into the stream, asking the young builder to consider whether the tool had lost its capacity to hold a measure simply because the old gardens were buried under the mud. Sano looked at the simple wooden scoop, the gray silt clinging to the dried willow bark, his voice tight and strained with an unspent, bitter sorrow, as he replied that the tool was useless without the gardens it was meant to sustain. He argued that the avalanche had destroyed the entire purpose of his labor, leaving him with nothing but an empty, ruined field of mud that could no longer hold a single drop of beautiful water. He confessed, his core tightening against the weight of his vulnerability, that his own spirit felt exactly like that silted scoop, hollowed out, broken, and completely stripped of its value because the structure he had poured his life into had vanished into the earth. The old nun sat quietly on the edge of her boat, the wet reeds rustling softly against the hull in the rising tide. She looked directly into Sano's tired eyes, touched the rim of the willow bark, and told him that the scoop was never defined by the particular garden it measured, nor did it lose its nature when the terraces were filled with silt. Mayoko pointed out that the capacity to hold space lived in the hollow shape of the willow bark itself, completely independent of the water that passed through it, and entirely untouched by the landslide on the hill. The agonizing void Sano held in his stomach did not come from the mathematical destruction of his irrigation walls. It grew entirely from his own exhausting habit of treating the buried structure as his own soul, refusing to let the container empty out without believing that his internal capacity to create had been buried with the stone. Sano remained completely still in the gray mist, the cold smell of the salt water settling deep into his chest as his hands slowly uncurled from their tight grip around his shovel. In that quiet room of shadow and water, he chose one small, profound act of discipline. He stopped the habit of treating every self-critical thought as an absolute truth, and he stopped fighting the reality of the buried field. He took one long, slow breath before his mind could declare his life a failure, allowing the empty, silted delta to exist exactly as it was without his resistance. He realized that the willow scoop was still whole, its capacity to measure space completely intact, waiting silently for whatever the changing seasons might bring to the valley. He laid the tool gently back into the boat, let his shoulders drop, and allowed the desperate need to rebuild the past to dissolve into the quiet depths of the wide river mouth. This was the transformation, a subtle shift from fighting the natural dismantling of his project to resting in the raw, uncarved space of the landscape that remained. As the tide began to pull the skiff away from the bank, the heavy, hollow ache wrapping around his midsection began to soften, letting his awareness expand past the narrow boundary of his ruined architecture. He recognized that his true value was not the intact garden, but the wide, enduring presence that had allowed the garden to be built, like the hollow willow scoop resting quietly in the dark boat. entirely at peace with the emptiness it carried. When we allow our attention to settle into the quiet spaces of our own late-night reflections, we begin to decode the hidden emotional engine that converts the natural fatigue of life into an ongoing sentence of internal friction. We often assume that our physical exhaustion is a direct consequence of the visible tasks we performed, or the actual hours we spent managing our outward responsibilities. But if you observe the distinct, heavy hollow ache currently resting directly within the center of your abdomen, you will find that the real consumer of your vitality is the continuous hidden act of resistance. It is the energetic strain of refusing to let the natural silt exist in the channel, the desperate attempt to manipulate the fluid uncertainty of life through the frantic application of your own suffering. We treat our minds as an active laboratory of defense, continuously replaying the past and rebuilding the collapsed walls with the memory of every perceived shortcoming, operating under the tragic delusion that if we keep our inner core raw and alert, we will somehow secure our worth against the changing currents of the world. This is the exact point where we can begin to separate the original weight of existence from the elaborate psychological armor the mind builds on top of it. Buddhist wisdom approaches this dilemma with a beautiful, direct distinction between the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is simply the raw, unpolished impact of being alive in a world constructed out of unpredictable currents and natural human limitations. It is the sudden arrival of deep emotional grief. It is the natural vulnerability of carrying a heavy project. It is the simple reality of being a human being who feels doubt, fear, or sadness when an ambition shatters. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, yes, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of our daily reality. We cannot control the arrival of the first pain, for the sudden landslip does not ask the permission of the irrigation builder, before it sends the heavy mud sliding down the slope to bury the terraces. The true torment begins when our thoughts take that first pain and knead it into a permanent moral identity, actively constructing the second pain out of our own resistance. The second pain is the elaborate mental trial we host right along our abdominal muscles and core, where we translate a temporary pattern of structural failure into a definitive commentary on our absolute value. We do not simply notice that we are feeling overwhelmed or empty. The mind turns inward and whispers, "Because you are struggling to hold this together, you are fundamentally inadequate, fraudulent, and banned from true peace." We do not just navigate an intense period of loss, our thoughts declare. This empty riverbed is proof that your core is inherently defective. This is the mechanism of turning temporary pain into a solid identity, the unfortunate habit of mistaking a natural, structural valley channel for an absolute pocket of rot that must be covered up with frantic labor. When we exist within this pattern of self-judgment, our awareness spends its late night hours rehearsing the future and replaying the past, frantically attempting to build a wall of hypervigilance against the terrifying landscape of human vulnerability. We stay awake repeating every decision we made before the storm, because we believe that our burning regret is a form of protection, that if we keep the inner dialogue sharp and critical, we will somehow force ourselves to be perfectly unshakable tomorrow. We develop an insatiable need for internal approval, trying to fix the self through a subtle application of shame, using our self-punishment as a temporary payment to satisfy the internal prosecutor we carry in our skin. But trying to heal your exhausted spirit through the accumulation of mental friction is like trying to preserve an irrigation canal. By covering the raw banks with heavy, dry silt, the crust remains trapped in the center, waiting to restrict your natural breathing the moment the light fades. True inner transformation does not manifest because you have finally forced every single flaw to disappear from your character through sheer willpower. It begins with the radical, quiet realization that peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is an entirely different relationship with the difficulty itself. It is the willingness to stand on the flat shoreline without immediately picking up the wooden shovel to hit your own core. When you allow the reality of the buried field to exist without transforming it into an absolute verdict on your soul, you are stopping the second pain before it can plant its roots in your body. You are choosing to sit quietly among the green reeds in the dark, letting the mud be mud, and letting the inner space be vast, without needing to apologize to the universe for the emptiness running through your foundation. As you let the frame support the heavy framework of your core right now, notice how the desperate urge to appear perfectly successful begins to lose its grip when it is met with simple, non-judgmental presence. You do not have to settle the record of your entire creative standing before the night ends, and you do not need to guarantee that your reservoir will be fully restored by tomorrow morning. The path toward inner freedom does not ask you to become a magically perfect statue who never experiences the sting of doubt or loss. It simply requires the very small, very steady discipline of noticing the tight drop along your stomach, naming it as the old defensive pretense and refusing to give its declarations the authority of truth. You are the vast, open delta that holds both the raw shoreline and the quiet boat. You are not the broken timber that is currently drifting away in the dark. In a moment, this gentle insight will move even closer to the small, ordinary triggers of your modern life, showing us how to carry this soft hand into the waking world without guilt. But for now, let your attention sink down into the quiet, unmoving center of your midsection. Let your lower abdomen expand outward on its own natural rhythm, taking up all the space it requires in the indigo shadows, completely free from the narrow metrics of outward performance. You are safe enough to drop the protective armor right here, leaving your spirit as unpolished, wide, and supportive as the heavy valley floor before the first canal network was ever dug across its surface. Now let this quiet understanding step softly across the centuries, moving out of the silent delta banks and directly into the small electric friction of your ordinary evening. The splintered oak timber and the silted willow scoop we have been exploring are not abstract concepts designed to live only within an old marsh archive. They are the exact configurations of energy you hold down in your abdominal muscles and your core when you lie awake at midnight, staring at the blank screen of your phone, waiting for a text message that might validate your value or offer a temporary reassurance that you have not driven away the people you care about. We live so much of our modern lives inside this digital hypervigilance, repeatedly checking our devices for an external metric of our strength, replaying a minor professional mistake or a perceived delay in our life path as if the sheer force of our anxiety could somehow rewrite the reality of our day. We perform the role of the unshakable anchor during the daylight hours, smiling warmly while feeling an immense heavy thickness inside our chest, carrying the constant worry that we are fundamentally falling behind our peers, or that our true unpolished self is simply not enough to sustain our connections. You can begin to transform this exhausting mechanism right in the middle of the very moments that cause your breathing to shallow, recognizing that peace is not an allure-nothing victory, but a quality practiced in the smallest, most unexceptional slivers of the day. When you find yourself caught in the frantic urge to control a relationship, check your notifications for validation, or fear the absolute uncertainty of the future, you are fully permitted to pause. A single slow breath taken before you offer an answer or look at your screen is a profound form of wisdom. It is a quiet, somatic realization that not every self-critical thought deserves your immediate obedience, and not every heavy feeling is an absolute command that must be followed into a Latinite internal courtroom. You are simply stepping out into the wide room of your own presence, letting the muddy residue of your daily tasks pass over your mind without allowing it to compromise the permanent, load-bearing foundation of your true stone valley. Perhaps you have spent years operating under the hidden law that your right to rest must be bought with a continuous display of flawless structural stability, and that wanting to let your eyes close while your inner difficulties remain unresolved is a form of guilt-ridden failure. We treat our rest as a luxury that must be earned through absolute competence, fearing that if we stop digging the silt or analyzing our vulnerability, we will be left completely exposed in the dark. But the scarred willow scoop does not feel a shred of remorse for sitting empty on the wooden deck, and the raw delta banks do not apologize to the river for letting their shapes change under the tide. You can rest without earning it first. Your exhaustion is not a moral debt that must be settled through hours of overthinking. It is simply the natural voice of an internal posture that has run out of vital energy from trying to carry the weight of an immaculate reservoir. It is entirely possible to care deeply about the work you produce, the people you support, and the growth you desire without gripping their outcomes so fiercely that you crush your own abdomen on the defensive armor. When we attempt to control the future, or hide our natural fatigue through the continuous application of our own shame, we are acting like Sano before his shovel was laid down, refusing to let the reality of the buried field exist as a natural configuration of a vast mountain slope. True inner freedom begins when you allow your living biography to be offered to the world with a loose, receptive hand. You can maintain your daily responsibilities, contemplate your growth, or rest your body with the simple, unforced presence of wet river grass, letting the surface pattern exist without demanding that it match a standard of absolute structural permanence. The next time the creeping drop of failure settles deep into your abdominal muscles, when you find yourself comparing your hidden, tired routine to the manufactured triumphs of those around you, look down at the quiet weight of your own posture and take a slow breath. The doubt you hid or the collapse you refused to accept is merely the external weather of a long, unpredictable human existence. You do not have to pretend the internal void did not feel heavy, and you do not have to force an immediate state of complete transformation before the raw edge of your exhaustion has even cooled. It is completely enough to sit with the uncertainty of your own unfinished healing, letting the irregular fragments of your day rest on the floorboards without needing to stamp them with the label of permanent ruin. In a few moments, the remaining definitions and standards of the daylight hours will dissolve entirely into the dark, leaving nothing but the vast protective space of this midnight room. As your limbs prepare to surrender their final defensive postures, release the illusion that you must secure every single boundary of your public identity before you are permitted to let your core relax. The expectations of the day carry no authority in this quiet sanctuary, and the unresolved washouts can remain suspended in the cool mist outside your window. Let your attention drop back down into the steady, unhurried rise and fall of your lower lungs, knowing that the load-bearing substance of your true nature is already fully intact, completely wide, and entirely at peace. The dark hour has fully arrived now, and the quiet gravity of the night is settling over your bed like the thick, cool fog that holds the open delta bank in absolute stillness. Every single effort you made today, every flawless structure you attempted to maintain beneath your core, and every anxious reach for reassurance has dropped its momentum, dissolving into the silence of this indigo-shadowed room. The heavy, unalterable expectations of the mountain ridge are no longer pulling at your midsection. They have slid away, falling through the floorboards into the damp earth, leaving your internal valley completely empty, spacious, and calm. Your abdominal muscles and your lower back are sinking a fraction of an inch deeper into the surface beneath you, as if the heavy timber of your inner nature were finally remembering its relationship with the steady, uncarved foundation of the landscape. Let your breathing become very small, very quiet, and entirely effortless. There is absolutely no need to regulate the air as it moves down through your chest. The body knows how to expand and soften on its own time, like the slow, steady movement of the coastal tide passing directly through the empty stalks of the marsh reeds. With every long, unhurried release of breath, the distinct, heavy, hollow sensation that you held across your midsection is letting go of its grip. The discordant lines of your vanished project are no longer being tracked or verified by an internal court case. The wooden shovels have been dropped onto the flat stone. The silted willow scoops are resting in the dark boat, and the high terraced channels have completely vanished beneath a blanket of silent, protective dark. You have permission to stop solving your life for tonight. The broken timber locks, the buried water gardens, and the blueprints for tomorrow do not require your presence while the marsh is cold. They can remain suspended in the shadows outside your window, completely separate from the living form that is resting here in the quiet. You are under no obligation to repair your entire biography before your eyes are allowed to close. You are permitted to be unwritten, unencored, and completely finished with the labor. resting within the safe sanctuary of an uncompromised night that asks for no full reservoirs before it offers you its blanket of rest. The teaching of the quiet delta shoreline is settling deep into the marrow of your bones now, filling the heavy spaces across your stomach with an enveloping tenderness. You are returning home to the pristine silence that was always waiting beneath your desire to contain the fluid path of your youth, the vast, unmeasured awareness that cannot be broken because it belongs to the raw, uncarved space of your own presence. Let the universe carry its own silent turning for the next few hours, while your spirit drifts further away from the language of structural permanence and transactional approval. Your abdomen is loose. Your core is heavy like damp river mud resting in the shade, and the cool, still rhythm of the evening is cradling your weary body as you prepare to slide away into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. What if the true capacity of the willow scoop has always lived in the open void it carries, rather than the water it was forced to hold? The cool, wet air of the open delta continues to drift softly through the room, cradling the heavy weight of your midsection just as the dark winter mist folds over the marshy banks, without asking the willow trees to change their natural shape. We accumulate a deep, silent exhaustion when we treat our own memories as a constant engineering project, turning a broken plan over and over in our thoughts, as if our fundamental safety depended on forcing an unchangeable history to rewrite itself. But the dark mud floor does not refuse to support the weight of the resting form, because the structures carried the scars of an unexpected flood, and the night does not require the strands of your achievements to be perfectly aligned before it agrees to cool the fever of your day. You are fully permitted to step away from the exhausting habit of acting as the guardian of your own empty reservoirs tonight, leaving the unfinished ledger of your regrets wide open on the desk, completely done with the labor of demanding a different outcome from a world that has already moved on. When we look directly into the spacious, unmoving hall right behind your eyebrows, we can see that true inner freedom is not a complex meditative achievement or a state of sudden, magical perfection that erases all human hesitation. It is simply the quiet willingness to sit on the damp earth beside the broken timbers, allowing the empty channel to be exactly what it is, without converting that past routine into a definitive commentary on your absolute worth. The mind creates the second wound when it takes the raw texture of a missed opportunity or a collapsed venture and kneads it into a permanent identity, whispering that because you chose a path that did not endure, you are inherently exposed, thinned, and unprotected from the vast ocean. But the person who made those original designs has already dissolved into the fluid stream of the past. The body resting against your sheets tonight is entirely new, its cells completely free from the old trajectory, its lungs breathing an air that has never been restricted by the walls of a previous year. Let the lingering tension along your jaw, your forehead, and your hands turn completely open now, as if the rigid knots were merely dry reed dust being carried away by a gentle internal wind. You do not have to solve the complications of your future before your eyelids are permitted to grow heavy, and you do not have to guarantee that your creative energy will look immaculately ordered by the time the morning light breaks across the room. The path toward an unshakable peace begins in these very small, unexceptional moments of the night when you notice a regretful thought arising. Name it gently as the old habit of control, and refuse to give its harsh declarations the weight of absolute truth. You are the vast, silent valley that contains both the empty riverbed and the wide ocean. You are not the broken plank that is currently losing its grip in the dark. Your limbs are remembering their natural weight, sinking effortlessly into the deep support beneath you as the desperate urge to fix your biography finally runs completely out of momentum. The heavy iron tools of your daily performance have been laid down in the grass. The long, difficult effort of trying to buy your safety through absolute predictability is over, and the world asks nothing more of your hands for the next few hours. Every unchosen direction, every buried garden, and every modern comparison can remain exactly where it fell on the path outside, losing its structural power in the growing dark. You are safe enough to drop the defensive armor right here, letting your breath become so thin, so quiet, and so unhurried that it feels like nothing more than a gentle ripple moving through a cool mountain pool that has completely run out of wind. The separation between the wide, unmoving stillness of the delta clearing and the spaciousness inside your own chest is fading away entirely now, leaving nothing but a clean, empty vessel cradled by the dark. The thoughts that were twisting into intricate knots a few hours ago are losing their sharp definitions, melting away like evening smoke dissolving over the distant ridges until the stone face of your awareness is completely gray, blank, and untroubled by memory. You are home in the silent sanctuary of your own being, a clean and receptive vessel resting on the solid ground, entirely released from the requirement to produce a melody or justify your existence through a display of perfect symmetry. Let your mind dissolve completely into the heavy rhythmic peace of your body, allowing your weary soul to slide effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. The dark watermarks left on the smooth surface of the willow scoop do not diminish the fiber of the wood beneath it, and the vast bay stretching over the shoreline does not shrink, simply because a builder draws a square basin to keep out the tide. All the frantic, heavy weight that compressed your midsection during the day, the exhausting effort to measure whether you have built far enough or fast enough, and the sharp regret over the paths you declined out of fear, all of it is losing its hold under the immense, cool dark of this late hour. The mind can finally lay down its heavy shovel, because the space you occupy tonight cannot be locked away by an old choice, nor can your true depth be measured by the condition of a single structure. You are simply here, a living presence breathing in the quiet, completely separate from the boundaries that were drawn in a yesterday you have already left behind. When we look directly into the wide, windless space of your own internal presence, we find that our true capacity for liberation is not a destination reached at the end of a long, straight canal. It is much more like the profound, load-bearing mud of the vast delta that allows a broken instrument to trace its tiny circle, while the remaining landscape continues to hold its ground with absolute stability. The stagnation that felt so cold and hollow in your lower core tonight was never your core reality. It was merely a temporary design running across the surface of your memories. You do not need to fill the old grooves with your current exhaustion, and you do not need to force a different life out of a past that has already dried. You only need to remain still, heavy, and entirely present, letting the fixed track sit on the floor until the restless friction runs completely out of air. Think of how much vital energy has been traded in the effort to maintain a flawless line in an unpredictable world, to force a fearful mind to be courageous before you permit your own core to find comfort. That constant holding, that perpetual readiness to defend your choices against the judgment of your own thoughts, is the very thing that has left your posture feeling so thinned and cold at the end of the day. But tonight, the irrigation tables are dark, and the machinery is still. The caution of your youth is not a permanent flaw in your soul. It was simply an event that occurred in a changing world of uncertainty, completely powerless to diminish the deep, uncarved nature of the spirit resting against your linen tonight. You do not need to rewrite your career before you are allowed to rest, and you do not need to change your history before your eyes are permitted to close. Let your attention sink down even further now, moving past the soft expansion of your chest and settling into the absolute immobility of your lower core. Feel the profound, grounding weight of your body as it yields entirely to the support beneath you, completely cradled by the quiet intelligence of the earth. The stone mill houses have held the weight of the winter rye and the freezing river water through thousands of seasons, without needing a single mile of progress to justify their existence. And they are fully capable of holding your weary limbs tonight. You do not have to hold the weight of your achievements anymore. Every unchosen road, every safe routine, and every modern comparison can remain exactly where it fell on the path outside, losing its structural power in the cooling night air. The breathing of your body is becoming so thin, so quiet, and so effortless that it feels like nothing more than a faint whisper of wind, moving through an empty loft. After the shutters have been fastened for the winter, there is no longer any separation between the immense silence of the harbor and the stillness that is expanding within your own skin. The thoughts that were replaying your past caution a few hours ago have turned into pale, translucent shadows, dissolving into the deep, unmeasured pool of your awareness without leaving a single line behind. You are returning to the ancient, untroubled home that existed long before the first track was ever worn into the stone, the silent, uncarved space where you are already wide, already safe, and already deeply at peace. Let the final definitions of the day slip away entirely now, leaving your spirit as wide, hollow, and unbothered as the vast delta resting in the evening shade. There are no accounts to balance, no circles to justify, and no versions of your courage to defend in this beautiful protective dark. The universe will manage its own paths without your assistance, and the morning will bring its own light when the time is right. But right now, in this single pocket of pure presence, nothing is required of your feet but the simple willingness to drop the weight of the track and rest. Let your mind dissolve completely into the heavy, rhythmic peace of your body, allowing your weary soul to slide effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep.